Hallo Filmstarts-Fans, ich bin Sebastian und wer mir auf Instagram unter die blonde Gefahr folgt, weiß, dass ich vor kurzem Deborah Chow hier bei mir im Studio begrüßen durfte. Sie ist die Regisseurin der neuen kommenden Star Wars Serie Obi-Wan Kenobi. Mit ihr habe ich mich so ein bisschen über die Serie unterhalten. Sie hat ja hier damit auch quasi ihr erstes so richtig großes Projekt. Sie hat zwar auch schon bei vielen anderen Sachen mitgearbeitet, aber bei so Serien wie The Mandalorian, Better Call Saul, Iron Fist, Jessica Jones oder Fear the Walking Dead immer nur so 1-2 Episoden gemacht. Hier war sie jetzt wirklich für die komplette Serie als Regisseurin verantwortlich und deswegen habe ich mich mit ihr zusammengesetzt. Natürlich fing das ganze Gespräch denn damit an, dass wir uns erstmal über Ewan McGregor unterhalten haben. Ich meine, er hat in Episode 1 bis 3 Obi-Wan Kenobi gespielt. Jetzt 17 Jahre nach Episode 3 kehrt er zu dieser Rolle zurück und das ist natürlich irgendwie was total Spannendes, weil ob man die Prequels nun mag oder nicht, man kann sich wirklich einig sein, alle mögen Ewan McGregor als Obi-Wan und das war dann auch so mein Einstieg in dieses Gespräch mit Deborah Chow. What did it feel like being the one who has to bring this iconic character back to the small screen?
Yeah, it was challenging, and it's been challenging in large part because, you know, obviously these characters are so iconic and just the legacy of the whole project. You know, it's between two trilogies, and, you know, these are characters that George invented. So there's been a huge responsibility, but at the same time, it's also been incredibly exciting and an honor to get to tell their stories.
So what's new with Obi-Wan right now without going into spoiler territory?
Yeah, well, we are 10 years after Revenge of the Sith, so it's actually a really interesting period in his life. You know, because we're coming out of Order 66, he thinks he killed Anakin, you know, and most of the Jedis have been killed or they're in hiding. So we're picking up at a point in his life when the world around him is very dark. You know, the Empire's in ascendance and all the Jedi, he's in hiding. And then also on a personal level, he's also carrying a tremendous weight coming into the series. So it's interesting to get to start the character in such a dark place.
How was it for Ewan McGregor? I mean, he's played him for 3 movies and now he's back after such a long time. Did it feel natural for him to come back into this role?
Well, it looked very natural. I mean, the first time, honestly, I think we did a camera test, and the first time he came to set, you know, sort of dressed as the character, he slipped into it so easily. And it was, for me, it was pretty special because it was like, the minute he sort of stepped on a set, you're like, oh, that's the whole series, you know, he is this character in such a quintessential way. And he just, you know, it's one of those, for me at least, one of those moments where you get a character and an actor coming together in the exact right role.
And you're the one who will bring us back the most iconic fight, Anakin versus Obi-Wan. How did you tackle that? How do you go about doing something like that?
Yeah, it's, you know, bringing back Darth Vader, it was something that we did not do lightly. You know, there's obviously a responsibility to that, and you don't want to bring him out unless you really need to. But for us, I think the main thing for me is that I always just tried to stay focused on the story and the character. And when we were developing the story, when you look at Obi-Wan's life and everything that happened in the prequels and then going on to A New Hope, Anakin and Vader are such a huge, pivotal part of his life, and especially emotionally. So for us, it felt very justified that he would be part of this story. So a lot of, you know, what we're trying to resolve or trying to work through in the series is about those two coming out of Revenge of the Sith.
Ja, ich muss sagen, ich bin wirklich gespannt, wie die Serie dieses Aufeinandertreffen zwischen Obi-Wan und Anakin Skywalker lösen wird, weil man muss ja auch schauen, dass die Kontinuität zu Episode 4 noch passt, weil, das sagt sie ja hier selbst auch, die Serie spielt 10 Jahre nach Episode 3, also theoretisch ist da ja auch noch genügend Platz nach hinten raus, um das hier jetzt irgendwie aufzubauen, aber auf jeden Fall wird es verdammt cool sein, Anakin versus Obi-Wan noch einmal zu erleben. Nicht weniger spannend finde ich aber auch die Tatsache, dass uns die Obi-Wan-Serie das erste Mal Live-Action-Inquisitoren zeigen wird. Die tauchten ja das erste Mal in der Rebels-Serie auf, dann gab es sie auch in dem PS4-Spiel Jedi Fallen Order und natürlich in zig von den Comics. Und diese Gruppe, die ja von Vader und dem Imperator gegründet wird, um die letzten verbliebenen Jedi zu jagen, finde ich wirklich wahnsinnig spannend und ich hoffe, dass die Serie auch diesen Figuren absolut gerecht werden wird, weil wir sehen sie sehr, sehr häufig schon in den unterschiedlichen Trailern und da muss sich natürlich Deborah Chow auch fragen, wie geht man mit sowas um, dass man das erste Mal solche Figuren in Live-Action umsetzt? And I'm really excited about the introduction of live-action Inquisitors. So how did you manage to put them into this whole story?
Well, they were actually a very natural fit for the timeline because this is actually what they were doing. They were hunting Jedi during this period, and they're under Vader and Palpatine. So it made perfect sense to have them, and it was quite exciting to get to the characters that Dave started in Rebels is to get to bring them into live action. And I was particularly excited about we have a new Inquisitor named Reva, played by Moses Ingram. And it was exciting to get to do sort of a young female dark side villain.
Star Wars hat ja schon immer irgendwo auch Meilensteine der Technik gesetzt. Das hat man in der Originaltrilogie gesehen, das hat man dann auch in den Prequels gesehen und vielleicht auch irgendwo so ein bisschen in den Sequels, wenn man die dann mag. Aber gerade die neuen Serien setzen wirklich neue Maßstäbe und das passiert aufgrund einer neuen Technik, die Stagecraft heißt. Angefangen hat dieses Stagecraft-System noch bei Rogue One, wo Kameramann Greg Fraser gesagt hat, okay, ich brauche irgendwie was anderes, um coole Bilder zu erzeugen und hat dann angefangen mit LED-Monitoren zu arbeiten, die sein Set erweitert haben. Daraus wurde dann dieses Stagecraft quasi ein kreisrunder Zirkel bestehend aus einer riesengroßen LED-Leinwand, die quasi den Greenscreen ersetzt. Das heißt, die Schauspieler können wirklich die Hintergründe, vor denen sie agieren, sehen. Das bedeutet auch, dass das Licht viel natürlicher ist, weil man es einfach durch die LEDs beeinflussen kann. Diese Technik ist wirklich absolut faszinierend, wurde ja mit The Mandalorian ausgebaut und wird seitdem immer verfeinert. Selbst Filme wie The Batman oder der kommende Tor 4 oder auch Ant-Man 3 benutzen das mittlerweile, weil es einfach ein ganz anderes Arbeiten für Kameraleute und auch Schauspieler ist. Und natürlich hat auch eine Deborah Chow in Obi-Wan Kenobi mit diesem Stagecraft-System gearbeitet. How does this help you as a director in filming these episodes?
I mean, honestly, with the technology, I loved it. And when we were doing it on Mandalorian, it was just emerging. Like we were, one of the first shows to do it. And it's actually every year that goes by, the technology advances. So a lot of the things we did on first season Mando, we couldn't do, we couldn't do on Mando, we can do now. So I was really excited to get to do the show using stagecraft, and it's a really interesting process because as a director, even in the development stage, I'm already thinking a lot of the times with the script about how would this translate into the volume and into stagecraft. And so sometimes you're even designing it and thinking about the blocking, and then we're doing previs, and then going into creating the 3D environment. So it's a really fascinating process, and I think for Star Wars, it's part of what's allowed us to be able to do television on a smaller budget and scale.
What are your inspirations for this series? Like, I mean, we've seen a lot of Western influences and Eastern influences in The Mandalorian. So what are your influences for this series?
I always look at Star Wars as, the DNA is so rooted in Westerns and samurai films that I always feel like that is always sort of the touchstone to return to, especially at Kurosawa. So I always look at that, but I think the difference for me was that with Mandalorian, when we were doing that tone for me felt a little more classic Western. We were really looking at, sort of the classic Westerns, the classic samurai films. So with this series, I was still using very much the Western and samurai tropes, but I was looking at ones that had, I was looking a little bit more on sort of the poetic, atmospheric side. So things like The Proposition or The Assassination of Jesse James, where you're telling a Western, but it's a bit more emotional and it's a little bit atmospheric and gritty.
Sounds pretty cool. You've done The Mandalorian, now you've done Obi-Wan. Is there a Star Wars project you would still like to do, or are you saying, oh, no, I'm done with Star Wars now, I need a break and maybe do something else?
I definitely need a break right now, but I don't know, honestly. Like, I think one of the most exciting things about streaming with Star Wars and with a lot of franchises is that it's opening up the galaxy, and Star Wars is a really good franchise for that because there's a really long timeline where you can do things in different time periods, and it's a huge galaxy. So I feel like there's a lot of stories and it's exciting to see people telling new stories with different voices.
Would you wish for a second season, or do you see this strictly as a mini-series?
We really did conceive it as just one big story with a beginning, middle, and end. I mean, you can never say never on these things, but really it was conceived as, you know, to be a sort of a special limited series.
And my last question, Star Wars has such a huge fan base. How do you deal with that, especially when you're bringing back someone like Obi-Wan Kenobi?
It can be intense, you know. The fan base is very passionate, and and especially with a project like this, you know, you really do feel that responsibility and weight. And I think every head of department that I had felt that too, where I've never worked on anything where every single detail was so important, because there would be somebody who would probably screenshot it and tell you did it wrong. So, you know, you have to be quite careful with it, but at the same time, you also don't want to get so tripped up in the details or the fan service or whatnot that, you know, it becomes a show about that. So I really tried to sort of focus it on the big picture. And a lot of the things I was doing with the writer, with Joby, was we would always kind of do a reality check to go, if you take the Star Wars out of this, does this still work?
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you so much for this interview. Tja, und das war mein Interview mit Deborah Chow, der Regisseurin von Obi-Wan Kenobi. Die Serie startet ab dem 27. Mai. Dann bekommen wir sogar gleich 2 Episoden auf einmal. Die werde ich natürlich auch hier auf Filmstarts covern. Dessen könnt ihr euch gewiss sein. Aber jetzt frage ich natürlich an dieser Stelle wie immer euch, wie sehr freut ihr euch auf die Obi-Wan-Serie? Was erhofft ihr euch von dem Ganzen? Und wünscht ihr euch da mehr von? Sprich also noch eine zweite Staffel, oder reicht euch da so eine Miniserie? Schreibt mir all das in die Kommentare. Und für mein Interview mit den Stars von Doctor Strange 2 klickt einfach mal hier drauf.